Papa, are we out of wood? Elska's small voice broke through the sound of the storm. February 1884. Outside, the fourth day of blizzard had buried Briarwell Crossing alive. Woodshed doors had disappeared behind walls of snow. One roof had already collapsed. Families were burning broken chairs, old flour barrels, even frozen fence rails to keep a little heat alive. But Setharin Vaylor, a homesteader on the edge of Gravelhook Flats, never reached for his coat. He slid the kitchen table aside, folded back an old wool rug, lifted a heavy hatch beneath the floor. Warm lantern light spilled into a cellar lined with neat rows of dry firewood. No snow, no ice, no frozen locks, no desperate race into the storm. 6 weeks earlier, people had laughed when they heard Setharin was digging a firewood cellar beneath his own cabin. They called it wasted labor. Some called it dangerous. On that morning, the blizzard answered for him. Every woodshed in town had been locked from the outside. Only one opened from within. Late August, 1883. Setharin stood beside the old woodpile stacked against the cabin's north wall. The split logs rested on narrow runners beneath the roof overhang, just as most homesteaders kept them. From a distance, it looked like enough. But Setharin no longer judged a winter by appearances. The previous winter had taught him differently. His wife, Mara Vaylor, had spent an entire night holding their youngest child, 5-year-old Elska, beneath 2 heavy quilts, while the cold crept through the cabin walls. Their older son, Tobin, only 9, sat near the door watching his father shave damp logs apart with a knife, searching for strips of dry heartwood that might catch a flame. The firewood had turned damp. Smoke had hung beneath the rafters until every blanket smelled of it. The old cast-iron stove glowed a dull red, never hot enough to push the cold back out of the room. Setharin never spoke about the fear he carried through that night. He only remembered Elska's shaking. From then on, the word enough no longer meant the same thing. Gravelhook Flats stretched across an open piece of Dakota territory where nothing slowed the prairie wind for long. Briarwell Crossing sat only a few miles away, close enough for news to travel, but too far away for help once a blizzard buried the roads. The Vaylor cabin stood on stone piers, its floor raised 22 inches above the ground. It had been built that way to keep the timbers dry after the spring thaw. One morning, while crawling beneath the cabin to retrieve a stray hen, Setharin pressed his hand against the soil. It was cold, firm, dry. The roof overhang blocked the driving rain. The gentle southern slope carried water away. Even drifting snow rarely settled beneath the floor. That was the moment the idea found him. Not another woodshed. A place where winter could never reach the firewood. That evening, Setharin turned over an old packing crate and drew a rough rectangle across the back with a piece of charcoal, 7 feet wide, 10 feet long, 4 feet, 8 inches deep. Mara set the lantern beside him before asking a single question. How will the cabin stay standing? He tapped the stone piers. They would never be disturbed. Every footing would keep a wide safety margin. Each base would be reinforced with fieldstone, while the excavated soil would become a drainage swale running south of the cabin. Mara nodded once. Then her eyes drifted toward Elska, already asleep beneath her quilt. The real question was never whether Setharin could dig the cellar. It was whether the cabin could survive, if he did, or whether another winter would take something far more precious, if he didn't. A few days later, Orrin Brackett, an older neighbor who had survived more Dakota winters than most men in the valley, stopped beside the cabin and listened without interrupting. When Setharin explained the cellar, Orrin shook his head. You'll be digging beneath the very thing keeping your family alive. He pointed toward the stone piers. Frost heave could shift them. Spring thaw could crack the walls. Meltwater might turn the cellar into a mud pit beneath the children's beds. His advice was simple. Build another woodshed. Face it away from the prevailing wind. Cover it with tarred canvas. If firewood ran short, he would lend a few wagon loads himself. Setharin thanked him for the offer. Then he quietly said, "Borrowed wood doesn't keep the next winter warm." After Oren left, Mara asked why he had refused the help. Setherin looked at the black scorch mark, still stained across the old cast-iron stove. It had been left by damp wood that barely burned the previous winter. Only then did he answer. Help runs out when roads close. Mara never argued. That evening, she opened an old ledger and ruled 3 neat columns across the page. Woodcut, cellar temperature, stove smoke. She never said she agreed. She simply began keeping the record. During the second week of September, while the prairie soil was still soft enough for a sharp spade and the mornings carried only a thin frost across the grass, Setherin finally broke the ground beneath his cabin. He refused to start with a wide excavation. Instead, he dug a narrow crawl trench from the outside access point first. Before committing to the cellar, he wanted to learn what the land was willing to give. The topsoil crumbled easily, tangled with tough prairie roots. Beneath it lay dense clay mixed with gravel. It held its shape better than he had hoped. He drove small wooden stakes into the ground, marking a safety line around every stone pier. None of the footings would be touched. Only then did he begin removing the earth, layer by layer, bucket by bucket. Tobin carried each bucket into the morning light without complaint. Mara shaped the growing pile of soil into a shallow drainage swale running south of the cabin. Elska had been warned to stay well away from the open trench. Yet every afternoon she stood quietly beside the porch, watching her father slowly uncover a place no one else could see. Each evening, before putting the shovel away, Setherin tied a simple plumb line to a floor joist and let the weight hang beside every stone pier. If even one line shifted, the digging would stop. Night after night, every line hung perfectly straight. The cabin had not moved, so neither did his resolve. A few days later, Cormac Vale, the carpenter who had built barns, sheds, and porches across Briarwell Crossing, stopped beside the excavation while measuring a nearby stable door for repairs. He studied the fresh earth without a smile. Then he knelt beside the opening and looked into the shadow beneath the cabin. Where will the wet air go? He explained that timber did not need rain to rot. Cold soil trapped moisture. Warm air drifting down through the floor carried even more. Leave one quiet corner, with nowhere for damp air to escape, and mold would begin its work long before anyone noticed. Setherin showed him the plan. A low intake shaft beneath the northeast eave. A higher exhaust shaft near the southwest corner. River cobbles lining both passages to keep the walls from collapsing. A bent willow grate to stop mice. A thin clay and lime coating to hold the earthen walls together and keep dust down. Cormac listened carefully. Then he looked back into the darkness. If the air chooses the wrong path, he said quietly, you won't have a firewood cellar. You'll have the finest damp box in Dakota. Cormac's warning stayed with Setherin long after the footsteps faded. That evening, he lit the stub of an old candle and climbed into the unfinished cellar. The smoke trembled for a moment, then drifted almost nowhere. Mara wrote exactly what he dictated. Air, lazy, not enough pull. Setherin never crossed the words out. Instead, he told Tobin about a grain warehouse where he had worked as a young laborer in Minnesota. The grain had not spoiled because rain reached it. It spoiled because damp air had nowhere to escape. Anything meant to survive a winter, he said, watching the candle smoke again, has to breathe. The next morning, he stopped widening the cellar. The ventilation shafts would come first. Only after the air worked properly would the digging continue. A few afternoons later, Leora Kest, a practical woman from Briarwell Crossing, stopped by with a sack of dried beans to trade for Mara's mending. She noticed the open excavation before she reached the porch. Tobin was hauling another bucket of earth. Mara was writing numbers in the ledger. The opening beneath the cabin stood uncovered. Leora never laughed. She simply asked the questions everyone else had been thinking. What if that hatch doesn't seal? What if little Elska slips and falls? What if cold air climbs into the cabin all winter? What if Setherin spends 3 weeks digging and still doesn't have enough wood before the snow comes? She glanced beneath the table. A woodshed may not be perfect, she said, but at least it isn't under a child's supper. Mara answered first. The hatch would lock from both sides. A raised wooden lip would keep small feet from slipping across the opening. Once closed, it would disappear beneath a thick wool rug. Only then did Setherin explain the rest. The hatch would be built from 2 crossed layers of cottonwood planks. Between them would be sheep's wool taken from worn blankets. Around the edge, a strip of buffalo hide, treated with rendered tallow, would compress into a tight seal each time the hatch closed. Leora listened without interrupting. Then her eyes drifted away from the drawings, away from the excavation, and settled on Elska, quietly sitting on the porch steps with a rag doll in her lap. Mara noticed the look. She never said a word. Neither did Leora. She no longer needed an explanation. She had already understood why this cellar mattered. Once both ventilation shafts had been opened, Setherin widened the excavation with greater confidence. By the middle of October, the Firewood Cellar had finally taken shape exactly as sketched on the old packing crate. The floor sloped gently toward a narrow drainage channel on the south side. Every stone pier remained untouched inside its marked safety margin, while fieldstone reinforced each footing without changing the cabin's weight. The earthen walls were packed firm, then coated with a thin layer of clay and lime to reduce dust and help stabilize the surface. Nothing about the cellar was built to impress. Everything about it was built to last. River cobbles lined both ventilation shafts to prevent the soil from collapsing. Tobin bent green willow branches into small grates, tying them together with strips of rawhide to keep mice from entering without blocking the airflow. When Setherin lowered the heavy hatch into place, the prepared buffalo hide compressed perfectly into the raised wooden lip. Tobin crouched beside the edge and released a single chicken feather. The feather did not move. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Tobin smiled to himself. It was the first small victory the whole family had watched happen together. Word of the Firewood Cellar spread through Briarwell Crossing long before the work was finished. One windy afternoon, Reverend Asa Whitlock, the town's minister, stopped at the Valor cabin. He did not study the cellar like a carpenter. He looked at it as someone responsible for holding a community together. A house, he said, must stand on firm ground, not only with timber and stone, but with the spirit of the people living inside. He warned that self-reliance could slowly become pride. Sometimes a man refused help because he was wise. Other times he refused it because he could not bear to owe another neighbor. Setherin listened without interrupting. Mara remained silent beside the table. The community exists, the Reverend continued, so families never have to dig beneath their own supper table just to preserve their dignity. The words lingered in the room. Not because they were completely right, because they were partly right. Only then did Setherin answer. Dignity doesn't keep a child warm when the roads disappear under snow. The Reverend gave a slow nod. He left without anger, but he also left unconvinced. By the first week of November, the Firewood Cellar was complete, but an empty cellar had never saved a family. Setherin estimated they would need nearly 5 cords before the first deep snow sealed the prairie roads. Quantity mattered. Quality mattered even more. He chose standing dead ash for the longest, cleanest burns. Box elder would feed the stove through long, bitter nights. Split cottonwood would start the morning fire quickly before the heavier wood took over. Every piece had a purpose and a place. The smaller splits were cut light enough for Mara to carry safely down the hatch. Larger blocks stayed beneath the roof overhang as emergency reserve if the cellar ever needed to be opened less often during a storm. Tobin counted every load that disappeared underground, while Mara recorded the stove's smoke after each evening fire, learning which wood burned cleanest and which left too much soot inside the pipe. Soon, the work settled into a rhythm that felt older than memory. Before daylight, check the stove, walk to the woodlot, listen to the grain of each standing tree before the first swing, raise the axe, bring it down, stack, carry, count, begin again. Some days, Setherin split wood until his fingers barely closed around the hickory handle. On colder evenings, the cracks across his palms opened again. He would quietly lower his hands into a basin of cool water before anyone noticed the blood. He believed no one had, but Elska had. The next morning, without saying a word, she placed a small strip of clean cloth beside the stove before going outside to feed the chickens. Setherin saw it when he returned with another armload of ash. He wrapped the cloth around his hand. Then he picked up the axe again, because warm cabins were never built by a finished cellar alone. They were built one split log at a time. By the final week of November, nearly half of the cellar had been filled. Rows of standing dead ash rested neatly on cross pieces, each stack spaced a hand's width from the earthen walls so air could move around every log. Tobin had taken pride in lining them up so straight they looked like small fences beneath the cabin. Then, 3 days after a cold autumn rain, he stopped halfway down the ladder. 2 split logs in the west corner carried dark stains. Not much, barely the width of 2 fingers. But it was enough. Setherin set his axe aside without a word. He never insisted the marks were nothing. He never claimed the cellar was working perfectly. He picked up both logs, held them beneath the lantern, then passed one to Mara. She smelled it. The wood had not begun to rot, but the scent of damp earth had reached it. Cormac Vale had been right. Without hesitation, Setherin carried every log from that corner back into the cabin and stacked them beside the stove to dry again. Tobin watched in silence. His face turned pale, as though he had somehow ruined weeks of work with his own hands. Setherin rested one cracked hand on the boy's shoulder. "A mistake found early," he said, "is a cheap gift." The lesson was never about perfect work. It was about finding the truth before winter did. That night, after Tobin and Elska had fallen asleep, Setherin carried a candle stub, a strip of linen, and Mara's ledger into the cellar. He lowered the hatch until only a narrow gap remained, enough for Mara to hear him if he called. The lantern went dark. Only the candle burned. He held the flame beside the intake shaft. The smoke leaned for a moment. Then it curled back on itself. Near the center of the cellar, it drifted a little farther, before slowing again. When he reached the west corner, the smoke almost stopped. It hung in the still air, as though the cellar had forgotten how to breathe. Mara quietly wrote the observation. West corner stale, cloth damp after night rain, cellar 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Setherin stared toward the ceiling joists for a long moment. The underground cellar itself was not the mistake. The air was. The intake sat too high. The exhaust sat too low. Prairie wind swept cleanly over the cabin roof, but the outlet remained trapped inside the dead air, curling behind the south wall. He climbed back into the cabin, turned over the old crate board once more, and drew another sketch with charcoal. The intake would go lower. The exhaust would rise higher. A simple wind hood would be added, so the passing wind could pull stale air outward instead of forcing it back inside. Mara studied the drawing. "Can you finish it before the next cold front?" Setherin did not answer. He slipped the candle into its tin box. Without another word, he reached for his coat. Winter was already walking toward them. At first light, Setherin left the splitting block untouched. Firewood could wait. The cellar could not. He lowered the intake shaft beneath the northeast eave, where the roof offered better shelter from rain and drifting snow. A shallow wooden hood covered the opening, hidden beneath woven willow branches that kept blowing snow out, while letting fresh air pass through. The southwest exhaust demanded a different answer. Setherin fastened an old length of stovepipe above the outlet and shaped several scraps of tin from a rusted oil drum into a simple wind hood. He turned the opening away from the prevailing wind, so every strong gust crossing the roof would create suction instead of pressure. Tobin held the nails. Mara steadied the ladder. Elska sat quietly in the doorway with her rag doll, watching the work without understanding why it mattered so much. By late afternoon, the prairie wind returned. Setherin climbed into the cellar once again and lit the candle. This time the smoke leaned immediately. Then it stretched into a thin gray ribbon, flowing steadily toward the exhaust before disappearing outside. Tobin watched from the ladder. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "It's breathing." Setherin never celebrated. He reached out and rested his hand against the cool clay wall. The land had pointed out the mistake. Now it had accepted the correction. For the next 3 days, the Vaylor family tested the cellar the way a careful craftsman tested a repaired tool. Nothing was assumed. Everything was measured. Mara hung a damp strip of linen in the west corner. Tobin placed small split blocks of firewood in 4 locations beside the intake, at the center of the cellar, in the west corner, and near the exhaust. Each morning, Setherin recorded the temperatures. Outside, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Cellar, 40, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Beneath the hatch, 40, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Near the exhaust, 45 degrees Fahrenheit. After the first night, the cloth no longer felt heavy with moisture. By the second day, it folded dry between Mara's hands. On the third morning, every test block still smelled clean. No fresh stains appeared. No trace of damp earth returned. Without a word, Mara stepped to the table and turned back to her earlier records. Where a skeptical question mark had once stood, she quietly drew a small circle. It was only a mark on a page. Yet Setherin studied that little circle longer than he would have looked at any compliment. That evening, a single stick of ash from the cellar caught fire almost immediately. The flames burned bright, steady, and nearly smoke-free. As the warmth spread through the cabin, Mara rested her hand gently on Elska's shoulder while the little girl slept. She never woke her. Setherin noticed the gesture. He said nothing. The cellar had passed its first honest test. Now only winter remained. The first real storm arrived in the middle of December. It was not the worst storm of the season. It was only strong enough to expose careless preparation. Cold rain came first. By nightfall, every fence rail, wagon wheel, and woodshed door wore a thin shell of ice. Before morning, a light snowfall covered it all, hiding the frozen surface beneath a clean layer of white. Around Briarwell Crossing, people still reached their woodsheds. But not easily. Axes chipped at frozen stacks. Shovels cleared narrow paths. Hammers struck ice from stubborn door latches. Most folks shrugged it off with a laugh. That's just winter. At the Vaylor cabin, Setherin never stepped outside for fuel. He lifted the hatch. The cellar still held at 44 degrees. The ash remained dry. The cottonwood caught quickly. The stove drew a clean, pale stream of smoke that climbed straight into the cold sky. The following afternoon, Orrin Brackett stopped by. Ice still clung to the edge of the scarf around his beard. Fresh cuts crossed the knuckles of one hand, where a hatchet had slipped while he hacked ice away from his woodshed lock. "My shed was just a little stubborn," he said with a tired grin. Setherin offered no argument. He simply opened the hatch. Orrin looked down into the cellar. Every stack remained loose. No snow. No frost. No frozen joints between the logs. He stood there longer than he intended. Finally, he broke the silence. "A little storm doesn't prove a whole winter." Setherin nodded. No. He rested one hand on the edge of the hatch, but it asked the first question. Orrin looked back into the cellar one last time before climbing the steps. For the first time since the digging had begun, he walked home carrying more doubt about his own woodshed than about Setherin's cellar. Near the end of January, 1884, the barometer began falling faster than anyone liked to see. Old settlers noticed something long before the first snow arrived. The prairie grew quiet, the kind of silence that belonged to hard winters. During the first night, the wind shifted 3 different times. By dawn, the storm had found its strength. The snow did not fall. It flew. It swept across the open ground in long white sheets. It slipped through tiny cracks around doors. It struck the south wall of every cabin like handfuls of dry sand. Across Briarwell Crossing, families hurried to protect what they could. More rope went around woodshed doors. Extra posts were wedged beneath low roofs. Loose boards were nailed down one last time. It was honest work. It was also work meant for rain falling from above, not snow driven sideways from every direction at once. By the second day, the wind had sculpted drifts as high as the shed roofs. By the third, some woodsheds had almost disappeared. Doors vanished behind solid walls of snow. Low roofs sagged beneath the growing weight. Outward opening doors became useless, locked shut by drifts packed as hard as frozen clay. Weak rafters groaned. A few began to crack. Inside the Valor cabin, instead of frantic panic, there was an unusual stillness. Setherin never even reached for his coat. Everything that needed to be done had been finished months ago. On the kitchen table, the ledger lay open. Mara quietly logged a single observation beneath the morning temperature. Road gone. No one explained the words. No one needed to. Tobin looked at the page, remembering the previous winter when they had waited for help that never arrived. He remembered his father's words. Help runs out when roads close. Now the roads were gone. The blizzard had stripped away every escape route. From this moment on, their survival no longer depended on prayers or luck. It rested entirely on what lay beneath their feet. By the fourth day of the blizzard, Briarwell Crossing no longer looked like a town with woodsheds. It looked like a line of white roofs beneath a sky that refused to clear. One by one, every familiar solution surrendered. Orrin Brackett fought his way toward his woodshed before sunrise. He shoveled a narrow path through shoulder-high drifts, only to watch the wind erase his footprints behind him. When he finally reached the door, the packed snow had forced it inward so hard that one hinge had already begun to bend. He stood there, with his hatchet in hand. The door never opened. Across town, Cormac Vale stopped beside a woodshed he had built for the Pritchard family years before. One corner of the roof had collapsed where wet snow had gathered beneath the eaves. The workmanship had not failed. The weather had found a weakness the design had never been asked to face. Not rain from above. Snow driven sideways. Leora Kest exhausted the last dry wood stacked beneath her porch roof before noon. The remaining pile had frozen into a solid mass beneath layers of ice. She walked back inside without complaint. Then she quietly removed 2 old pantry shelves from the wall. She never looked toward her children while breaking them apart. At the church, Reverend Asa Whitlock welcomed 2 families into the sanctuary, hoping its large stove could keep everyone warm until the storm weakened. But the woodbox beside the vestry held only soft, damp wood. The fire struggled. Dark smoke rolled from the chimney, thicker than the heat rising from the stove. Across Briarwell Crossing, more chimneys began breathing black. In stark contrast to the ruin outside, the cellar beneath the Valor cabin quietly did its work. The faint whisper of the windhood was the only sound signaling the system was still breathing in rhythm. When Setherin brought up splits of wood that were dry, loose, and completely free of the smell of damp earth, the fire in the stove answered with a clean, pale stream of smoke. At the table, Mara sealed away the destruction of the day with one short entry. Cellar 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood loose, smoke clean. The blizzard might have buried every woodshed in town, but it was powerless against the space 4 feet beneath the Valor family's supper table. On the 5th night of the blizzard, the temperature fell to 37 below zero. The wind pressed against the cabin hard enough to make the walls groan. Just before midnight, Setherin rose to feed the stove. When he turned back toward the cast iron, Mara was already awake. Neither of them spoke. Their eyes settled on the children's bed. Tobin slept curled beneath his blanket. Elska rested on her side, her cheeks warm with color instead of pale with cold. One small hand still held the strip of cloth she had once left beside the stove for her father. The fire caught, not with a roar, with quiet certainty. Setherin remained beside the stove long after the flames settled into steady heat, listening to the wind strike the cabin without reaching the people inside. Nature was still stronger than any man, but that night, it did not take the child. When the blizzard finally broke, Briarwell Crossing did not return all at once. The town emerged slowly, as though it had to be uncovered from its own grave of snow. Orrin Brackett was the first to reach the Valor cabin. He came on foot. His shoulders were bent from days of shoveling, and fresh cloth wrapped around his cracked hands. Half of his woodshed still lay buried beneath a frozen drift. He offered no long apology, only one quiet request. "May I see it again?" Setherin stepped aside and opened the hatch. Orrin looked down at rows of firewood that would last for weeks. He stood silently before saying, "Frost never reached it." A day later, Cormac Vale came. He inspected the wind hood, the intake, the higher exhaust, and finally the west corner that had once smelled faintly of damp earth. He ran his hand across the clay and lime wall. Not a trace of mold, not a fresh stain. He nodded once. "This wasn't luck," he said. "It worked because you corrected it before winter corrected you." Leora Kest visited after that. She carried a fresh loaf of bread tucked beneath a cloth. While the men stood outside examining the ventilation shafts, she spoke quietly with Mara inside the cabin. "When spring comes," she said, "I'd like to learn how to build the hatch safely." Mara smiled. "I'll teach you." She never looked towards Setherin. She didn't need to. Some parts of the cellar had always belonged to her. Reverend Asa Whitlock came last. The days after the blizzard had been spent helping neighbors repair roofs and bury a cow that had frozen along the edge of town. When he entered the Vaylor cabin, he carried no sermon. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table that rested above the hatch he had once questioned. For a while, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about what I said." His hand rested on the tabletop. "I believed a house stood on firm ground because no one disturbed the earth beneath it." He looked toward the floor. Perhaps a house stands just as firmly when someone understands the ground deeply enough to change it with care. Setherin listened. The Reverend met his eyes. "I was wrong to mistake your preparation for pride." After another silence, he added one more thought. "But now that you know how to build this, you mustn't keep it to yourself." Setherin glanced toward Mara. Mara looked at the ledger resting on the shelf. Near the doorway, Tobin listened as though hearing the kind of lesson no schoolhouse could ever teach. "When the spring thaw comes," Setherin finally said, "anyone willing to learn about soil, drainage, ventilation, hatch construction, and the places that should never be dug is welcome to come." The Reverend nodded. Neither man had won. The town had. Because wisdom only survived when it was passed forward, with the same care used to discover it. Spring finally softened the frozen ground. Not every family in Briarwell Crossing dug a cellar beneath the floor of their cabin. Setherin made certain of that. He warned people against copying what they did not fully understand. Loose sand required another answer. Wet ground required another answer. Cabins without solid stone piers required another answer. If water had nowhere to drain, the shovel stayed in the shed. If a hatch could not seal tightly, the floor remained untouched. If airflow had never been tested, two ventilation shafts were nothing more than holes in the ground. Some families simply raised their wood racks higher. Others rebuilt their woodshed doors to swing inward instead of outward. Several steepened their shed roofs before the next winter arrived. Only 3 homesteads, each sitting on firm clay with well-drained ground and strong stone foundations, built smaller versions of the Vaylor Cellar. Cormac inspected their footings before anyone dug. Mara showed mothers how to build and seal a safe hatch. Tobin demonstrated the candle smoke test, carefully keeping every child well back from the flame. Leora wrote down the safety rules for families with young children. Orrin Brackett, the first man to doubt the idea, delivered wagon loads of fieldstone to a widow whose cabin stood on the edge of town. Setherin never became famous. Each morning, he still walked to the woodlot. He still split each log to the size he trusted. He still opened the ledger whenever the wind changed direction. Years later, after Tobin had become a grown man himself, he realized he remembered very few of his father's words. He remembered different things: the sound of the hatch lifting, the steady whistle of wind passing over the metal hood, the clean smell of dry ash waiting beneath the floor, and the quiet face of Elska, sleeping through the coldest night Dakota could deliver. Frontier wisdom was never about building something unusual, simply to prove a point. It began by watching the land, the wind, the water, the soil, the limits of a family's home, then doing what those conditions demanded before nature arrived, with questions no words could answer. Setherin Vaylor never defeated a Dakota winter. No one ever did. He only removed one path the winter had always used to enter his home. On the American frontier, sometimes that was enough to keep a family alive.